everybody. I'm Aaron Simmons, professor of philosophy here at Furman, and thanks for joining us for another Philosophy Pathways Alumni Conversation. I am joined today by almost Dr. Judith Carlisle, who is a 2016 grad of Furman, a double major in biology and philosophy. And while she was at Furman, did amazing things, presented at a bunch of conferences, won the best paper award at a conference up in Asheville, I remember, and is now working on her PhD, going into the dissertation stage at Washington University in St. Louis in the philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience program, doing amazing, amazing work. So Judith, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, to start off, just tell us kind of what you've been doing with that general intro. How did you get there? How did you go from being a Furman student to now finishing a doctorate at WashU?
Yeah, so when I was finishing up at Furman, I decided I was super interested in brains, but I didn't really know what about brains interested me. So I just applied out to a bunch of different programs, some philosophy programs, some psychology programs, just sort of all over the place. And I ended up going to a master's program at the University of Colorado in Boulder, which was really exciting for me because they have an institute in cognitive science, which was a way for me to think and talk about brains. And so I went there right after Furman, and I did the 2 years master's there. And then I applied out and went to where I am now in St. Louis, Washington University. And they have this really awesome interdisciplinary program, like you said, in philosophy, neuroscience, and psychology. So it worked out perfectly. I got to think about philosophy, but also as it relates to brain stuff. So that worked out really well. Yeah, that's sort of the general trajectory of how I got here. I think some people go straight to the PhD, but from what I've heard, that's getting less and less common. And I feel really happy, actually, that I did the master's first. At the time, I think I was like a little bit disappointed. I wanted to be really impressive. And so I wanted to go straight to the PhD. But I realized in retrospect that I learned a lot in those 2 years that really like set me up to be, you know, sort of like a pretty impressive first year student in this big fancy program that I got into at WashU. Yeah. And I think I would have just been so scared if I hadn't had that extra 2 years to get ready for that. So yeah.
No, that makes tons of sense. And I think you're right. A lot of people, talk what they call, gap years and things, right? And I hate that idea because it's only a gap from being in school. It's not a gap from life. It's not a year right. off, right? It's just a year intentionally doing something else. But I sometimes think that master's programs for people who are fairly confident that academic routes are what they want to do, master's programs sometimes almost serve as, a kind of gap year or two. You're obviously still in school, but the idea is, you're there only for a temporary thing. And there's this kind of weird exit ramp, a year or two out. Yeah. That if you're like, man, this just isn't, it's not my jam anymore, or something's changed, or my passions have shifted, there's a kind of nice space where you can change direction without it being, now what do I do? It actually allows you to, complete something and take a master's. And as I've said a lot, no one ever regrets having more degrees. They just regret the debt that the degrees usually come with. Right? Yeah. So, well, what advice would you give to current students who are maybe looking at grad school in particular, since obviously that's what better than any of the faculty currently here, because it was too long ago when we did it. What would you say to them?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's really awesome about the Furman program, philosophy program, is that you guys have representatives from a variety of different kinds of philosophy and areas of philosophy and styles of philosophy. And the more departments that I've seen, the more that I realize that that's really kind of rare. Yeah. A lot of departments really pick one thing and they just go all in for that one thing. But you guys have people doing like traditional Western analytic stuff. You guys have the more continental stuff, some ancient folks, some comparative stuff. And that, I think, is like a really awesome opportunity for students to get a sense for what it is that they really like about philosophy, and to get a sense for like which style or topic they're interested in pursuing. And then, so then you can use that information when you're trying to figure out which grad school that you want to go to. Once you realize that a lot of the grad programs are really particular, I've had friends who found themselves in programs where they're like, well, I studied continental philosophy, but now I find myself in this like purely analytic department. I don't know how this works. I wasn't trained in this. And then they're like, what do I do? And I feel like Furman students are like perfectly set up to not make that mistake, right? Because you can see like, okay, so I really like doing it this way and I don't like this other way as much, or I really like this topic. And so you can use that information to then look at the grad schools that are available and say like, okay, this one will be a really good fit because they have a bunch of people who are doing stuff just like my favorite professor at Furman. And I think I didn't really think about that kind of thing when I was graduating from Furman. And I just got really lucky along the way that I found people that I wanted to work with and that were willing to work with me. But I think that's like one of the things I think I've seen, sort of people struggle with the most, is finding themselves in a department where it's just not really their style.
Yeah.
So then, yeah, I think that's probably my biggest piece of advice is like make use of that awesome diversity that you have in the department and like take classes from a bunch of different people so that you could get a sense for like, okay, I really like doing ancient philosophy. Like I like thinking about like, what's the best interpretation of this like argument from Aristotle or whatever. Or I prefer thinking about the differences between like traditional Western philosophy and other philosophies from other parts of the world. Maybe that's what interested in. And then you can find grad programs that do those kinds of things.
No, it makes a lot of sense. How is it that you came to find the programs that you then entered, right? So I get asked questions a lot from students about, well, how do I even discover programs? And I give them some suggestions, but I'd also love to hear from somebody kind of in the thick of the forest. How would you recommend that they find the programs, find the places that are doing the thing that maybe Furman has opened to them as something they want to keep doing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I had no idea what I was doing when I was applying out the first time. I had gotten advice from you guys and I think that was really good advice, but I don't know if I did a very good job following the advice. I just sort of like randomly picked schools and I didn't really research the schools or get a sense for what the departments were like. And then later in grad school, I realized that that's not really what most people do. Most people are a lot more on the research heavy side of things. So I think there's a lot of information that you can get from departmental websites and stuff like that. But that's kind of a bit, dry and boring research. Some people are really good at that, but I was not very good at that. I ended up talking to people, like reaching out to current grad students in programs to get a sense for like what it is that they really liked about their programs and didn't like. And I still get emails. I do get emails from students like this, undergrads and people who are outside of, graduated from undergrad, but want to come back into the world of academia. And I think that's a really good strategy too. It's just to reach out to people and see what they think about the program. And then they will definitely have a good sense for what's available in the program. So like one of the things, so at WashU right now, we don't have an ethicist, like at all, but we have a bunch of incoming grad students who do ethics. And we're like, wait a minute, like this isn't a good thing. But if you look at our website, you might get the impression that we have an ethicist because we have people who teach ethics. But I think there's often the difference. You want to do your grad studies with someone who specializes in the area. That's at least the best case scenario. So if you don't want your dissertation advisor to be like a really early career instructor who teaches ethics sometimes. You want them to be someone who spent a lot of time thinking about ethics if you want to do ethics. And so, yeah, I think like looking at the websites is a good place to start. But then I think once you get like a list of like a reasonable number of schools that have areas that you're interested in, then you can reach out to a couple of people in those grad students, in those grad programs to get a sense for, you can say, I want to study ethics. So like, do you guys have like a strong body of students and professors who are doing stuff in ethics? And I guess the sort of, I'm maybe sort of purposefully avoiding saying like looking at the rankings, because that is a somewhat dangerous way to go, I think.
Yeah.
Partially because I don't know, like I keep saying over and over, I didn't really know what I was looking at when I was looking at the rankings. So I'm just like, it's easy to be like, all right, I'm just going to apply to the top 10 schools.
Right.
But it might turn out that the top 10 schools aren't the places where you're going to fit best. Like those top 10 schools, in a lot of cases, end up looking kind of similar and doing kind of similar stuff. And if that's not your interest, then it maybe isn't going to work out well, even if you got into one of those really awesome schools. So, I mean, of course, like you can read the lighter stuff and look at those rankings, and like, I'm sure that the students are going to do that no matter what. But I guess I would caution against taking all of that too seriously. Seems like your like happiness and well-being in the program are maybe more important than being on like a slightly higher ranked program.
Absolutely. Well, and that's a good point there at the end too, which is, you know, graduate school, unlike undergrad, it really is the job and the life and the all-consuming sort of, you know, fire that eats us up for however long we're there.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can have the greatest advisor in the world who's the biggest name in that field and just unreally just, wow, I got to work with this person who you've read all their books. But it turns out like maybe that person's on a year sabbatical this year, and maybe next year is on a grant, and maybe you, even in the best of times, only get to meet like once every couple months with that person because you've got to go through their personal secretary to even make a meeting, right? So a big thing to think through for students, I think, which you said so well, is what is the social aspect? What is the community like? What is it like to be a grad student here? Because at least for me, when I was at Vanderbilt and also at Florida State, it wasn't the faculty that were actually the on the ground people who made my time good or bad. It was the other grad students and the community that they had cultivated that I inherited when I got there, right? And so that is often something impossible to know, even if you talk to a bunch of faculty, because they're always going to just say, oh, it's wonderful, the grad students are great, and look at what I write, blah, blah, blah. But when you talk to grad students, they'll say, yeah, like it's a cutthroat department. And, you know, I don't really have a lot of friends in the department. That's not really kind of what we do here. And if you're a really social person, that might be alienating and complicated. But if you're somebody who is all about sort of, you know, doing the best in the game, hardcore, what, maybe that's a place you would thrive, you know? And so I think reaching out to grad students is definitely something that more undergraduates need to do more often. You know, and I'm glad that you encourage that. What would you've been at two different places, obviously Boulder and WashU have different kinds of cultures and different kinds of locations, and you know, the fishing and everything is better in Boulder. How would you describe just what grad school is like, right? This kind of generic question that unfortunately we get all the time. What's grad school been like for you? Has it been a time of joy and encouragement, or a time of despair and, you know, anxiety, or maybe a little of both? How would you tell people that?
Yeah. Sorry about the dogs.
No, your dogs are fine.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Let me hold on just a second.
No, you're good.
I'm so sorry.
You are fine. I have two birds and a dog, and most days a 12-and-a-half-year-old running around. So my house is a cacophony. Yeah.
Right. So let me know if you can't hear me.
No, you're good.
So I would say definitely a bit of both. There's been some moments of anxiety for sure.
Yeah.
Pepper, come here. I would say early on in particular, I think sorry, I'm going to try one more thing.
That's a really big dog to be named Pepper, by the way.
Well, so there's two. There's Pepper and Hank, and probably Hank is the
Hank sounds a little better. That's
okay. So about having fun and being stressed, definitely both.
Yeah.
I would say it's like honestly been, for the most part, progressing towards more happiness.
Good.
And that's part of the reason why I said the stuff I said earlier about the master's program.
Mm-hmm.
I think like there was a bit of a difficult transition from going in from this environment where I felt really comfortable and safe. I could like say really silly, goofy philosophical ideas or non-philosophical ideas
Mm-hmm.
around you and Baba and all these people that I'd become so close with over the years. And then I got into this environment where it was a little different, where all of a sudden it was like, oh, that sort of offhand comment you make at the reading group, then everyone's like, oh, wow, like I'm gonna like read into that one comment that the new student made and like,
yeah.
Right. So it is a little bit stressful to realize that you're being sort of judged by all of these people in this new way, but it's also like makes total sense. Because like you are encountered with 5 new philosophers each year in grad school, and you're like, oh, like let's learn about this new philosopher, and you start looking at what they do and what they say and what they're interested in. So I think it's totally natural, but it's also really scary to be under that lens. And then one of the things that was really great for me was I got to sort of make all of those blunders and then sort of be like, bye, I'm going to go to a different program where no one's seen me make all of these silly mistakes. So that was kind of nice. But I think also those mistakes, like everyone makes them. You get to grad school and like it's a new world and people are doing like crazy exciting work, and like everyone's working on some really technical project in some area you've never heard of, and like I don't know, it's really exciting, but it definitely is nerve-wracking at first. And I got thrown into teaching. So
Ooh.
My first year of the master's program was teaching my own recitations, which is pretty normal, but I had never taught before. I had like stood in front of a class, a handful of times for presentations, but that's about it. So that was definitely very scary. But the experience was great. I mean, I was like stood in front of the room like a stick for a couple of weeks, and then I loosened up and like got to sort of get a sense for what it was like to be in front of a group of 18-year-olds. And I don't know, it was very scary at first, but then I think you sort of learn and you get used to the new environment, as you do in any new environment, I think. And it's gotten a lot less stressful over the years. And now I think for the most part, it is just fun. Like, I guess there's this new, I guess every stage has little bits of newness, right? So I'm finishing up my prospectus, which is like a summary document of what my dissertation is going to be about. And I have to defend that. And like, that's going to be a little scary, but I don't know. I think it's at this point, it's more just about like doing philosophy and writing and less about constantly feeling judged or evaluated. And
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. When I went to Vanderbilt, the first 3 people I met were all grad students, kind of walking into the building, and I was social and trying to meet people and excited to be there. And I had already done a master's and a year of a doctorate elsewhere. And so again, I kind of had my sea legs, I thought. But I admit I was super intimidated, coming from Florida State, where I had gone to watch football, and, studied some philosophy along the way, to now walking into these distinguished gates at, Vanderbilt, where everybody pronounces it with a long A, right? And I was walking into the department. First person I met was finishing his PhD there at Vanderbilt in philosophy, but he had already finished a PhD in German at University of Frankfurt.
Wow.
Yeah. And then the next person I met was working on her PhD, finishing it up, but she had just finished a year-long Fulbright over in France or something. And then the next person I met was even most intimidating to me, because I was going there wanting to do Kierkegaard and stuff. And this guy had like just returned from the Hong Kierkegaard Library, where he was, working on Danish intensive coursework and all, And I remember, just kind of like turning around and going out by this tree and thinking like, what in the hell have I done? I can't play at this level, right? But one of the neat things, of course, is, you then start learning things like, oh, well, all those students were several years ahead of where I was. And by the time I was 3-4 years further along, I also had been to the Kierkegaard archive, and I also had studied Danish. And, suddenly this stuff that is super intimidating just becomes like why you go to grad school, is to have these experiences. And you are now among the best in the world doing this thing. And those experiences, those opportunities become a whole lot more frequent and common, having gotten into the places that then facilitate that. And so I think it's a helpful reminder. Yeah. Don't write it off because your first day scares the heck out of you. Eventually you'll scare some new 22-year-old walking on campus, right? What would you tell your former self if you could go back and say, hello, Judith, here are, the most important thing or two things, whatever, that, 6 year later self, what is it you would tell yourself, whether about grad school or adulthood or life or whatever? One of the things we want to make sure our students now understand is, when we talk about grad school or careers or next steps, all of that is just one part of who we are and who we're becoming. And so, what is it you would tell that, 20-year-old now, 6 years later working on a prospectus?
Yeah, that's kind of a hard one. I mean, okay, so I'm sure you remember, but you got me all obsessed with Kierkegaard too when I was at Furman.
And let me make clear, you still to this day have written the best paper on Kierkegaard I've ever gotten from an undergrad ever. And so it was stunning and changed the way that I read Kierkegaard in certain ways. And so, you were a badass.
That's too kind. But so one of the things that I found like maximally depressing about grad school was that no one cared about Kierkegaard anymore. And I was just like utterly depressed about this. I was like, every time I brought it up, people would be like, oh God, here we go again. He was talking about religion and continental philosophy. And everyone was like, ugh. And I remember just being so sad about it for a long, like pretty much for the master's program. Mm-hmm. And I felt like I couldn't talk about this thing that had been like really the thing that made me love philosophy.
Yeah. And
that was really awful. But then I don't really know what happened, but I just said, screw it. And I was like, I'm going to start my own Kierkegaard group. And I'm going to like read Kierkegaard with a bunch of smart people. And I'm going to invite all these analytic philosophers to come if they want. Some of them did.
Nice.
And I just wish that I had like done that sooner, like allowed myself to continue loving this thing that was like just a really important part of my love for philosophy. But instead I just was like, oh, that's not what people like. And I sort of like stamped it out for a couple of years. Mm-hmm. And I just feel like that was maybe, I shouldn't have done that. It was okay at the time, it was my way of coping. Right. But I think I probably would have been a lot happier if I had just said, you know what, like, this is what I like. And it's okay that I like doing this. Like I have to learn these, analytic philosophy of mind stuff that I have to learn to think about brains like I want to think about. But I can also still love Kierkegaard and think about and read Kierkegaard on the side. And I don't have to give that up to be an analytic philosopher.
So well said.
And that's probably my biggest.
Maybe I could hermeneutically flip that back to you as it is important, especially during college and then transitioning from college to whatever else we do. It's important to trust that our voice matters, right? And you, as smart as you were, and believe me, all the students watching this, like Judith would intimidate you. She was that good. But you and I talked a lot about trusting yourself and believing that you were as good as you really were and not being intimidated by all the people at the grad school and that you would be able to handle any of them at any level. And I think, the logistics of it's okay that I like Kierkegaard. And it turns out it's not just okay, but if you like Kierkegaard, it's probably the case that others will too, but they're the ones not saying it because they're scared of what, but if you're the one able to say, freaking guy rocks, why aren't we making more use of this? Suddenly it opens them up to feel like it's okay to let their voice be heard a little bit more as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. and bringing people in. Like, that's the thing. I've just been, people are like, oh, I just thought this was like, I'm not religious. So I just thought
Right.
I don't need to think about that stuff. And then I had just gotten such a great Kierkegaard education from you that I was like, oh, just you wait. Like, there's so much you can get from this. And that was a really exciting experience to be able to share that with people who were just like, ew, I don't like the way he talks. It doesn't make any sense. And then you'd be like,
That's
wait
so
a minute.
cool. I love it. It's interesting. When I went to Vanderbilt, one of the things that I was stunned by and was genuinely disappointed about was, I had grown up hearing and reading about, these discussion groups and book clubs and whatever. And, at Oxford, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Owen Barfield were all hanging out at the Bird and the Baby. And, here's where Tennyson and whoever were bantering this thing. And, this courtyard is where whoever, Newton and his friend, like there's just all these kind of stories, right? And if you read like Louis Manon's Metaphysical Club, it's about, all the pragmatists in America and like this sort of friendship that they cultivated. And you read about the salons in Paris and Jean Val, like hosting just his buddies to come over and like read what they're working on. And it turns out like out of that came almost all of deconstruction, right? And so you read this stuff and you think, man, if only I could get to a place like Vanderbilt, then I'll find this. No, you won't. What you'll find are a bunch of career obsessed people who are overscheduled and intimidated by everything in the world and just doing the best they can to make it to Friday so they can go across the street to San Antonio Taco Company and order a bucket of beer. Like, what I found was just the smartest kids from the fraternities and sororities. And like, it was disappointing because I thought I was walking into the hallowed halls of academe. And what I realized was, no, the faculty are way too busy and way too overwhelmed with their stuff. And they're still trying to get tenure or trying to get promotion or trying to leave and go from Vanderbilt to Duke or Duke to Harvard or whatever. And so I maybe because I wasn't as reflective as you, I decided, well, this is dumb. I wish it were different. So I guess I'll just have to do it, and would host these events called God and Guinness, where we would meet at this pub and talk about philosophy, religion, and engage the things that mattered. And it was really amazing because what started happening was it caught on. And then it wasn't me who was having to do it. It was just the community that had developed. And then all these ideas translated into 3-4 years later. Now we're co-authoring with each other. And then 6, 7, 8 years later, now we're writing books critical of each other. Like, and it creates that sort of dynamic that had I said, oh, I wish somebody had done this, they haven't, this sucks. I was like, well, they haven't, this sucks. I guess I should do it, right? And that idea of trusting yourself. Nobody's reading Kierkegaard, freaking start a Kierkegaard group.
Yeah.
And this is true whether they go to grad school or not. Whatever people do, you might wish there was a sewing club in your little town and so start one, right? Find a way to let the things you wish were true be true. And a lot of that just takes your own agency. So
yeah, for sure.
If you could, I'll ask you a joint question. What is the one thing that if you could do it again, you would do it 10,000 times over from college? Like, that was that was smart. Glad I did that thing. What is that thing? Right. And what is the thing that if you could do it over, you would definitely have done differently?
Okay. Yeah. So I think, studying abroad was probably the thing that I really am glad that I did, which is sort of like it's not a nice thing maybe to say, because not everyone like gets to do that.
That's definitely mine too, by the way.
Okay.
The semester I spent in Cambridge, England, hands down, best thing I ever did in college. Yep.
Yeah. I think probably those couple a month in Japan. Mm-hmm. And it was really awesome. And I've heard that this trip is not happening anymore, but getting to do the study abroad and it be like philosophically relevant was like a really amazing pairing of things. But I think just traveling in general in college was one of the things that, like, I even just like taking a weekend trip and going up to the mountains or going to Asheville, whatever it is, going on a hike.
Or 2 weeks in Vermont,
Yes, exactly. Oh, yes. Good thinking. Those memories, I think, have been really helpful in like keeping me going throughout. They're just like such positive things to look back on, and yeah, the relationships that I built on those like travel trips are just like incredible. So that I think was really a good thing that I did, that I am glad I did, and I would do much more of. I'm trying to think about like what I would change. I guess so. I briefly mentioned earlier about how I did the grad application process a little bit weird, and I think I would definitely change that up a bit. But I also, I mean, and maybe this is what you do when you make mistakes early on in your life, but you just sort of like build them into your narrative. Like that, making that mistake was like a really important part of what got me here. And like I said about like, I'm really glad I did the master's, but I wouldn't have done the master's if I had gotten into WashU. And so I don't know. I think like, how can I turn that into a something like a regret? Maybe just like allowing myself to like I mean, like it's okay to make mistakes, and like you'll look back on those mistakes later and maybe they won't even look like mistakes anymore. You'll just be glad that they happened. So I don't know, maybe that's a cheating answer.
It's like your boy Soren says, right? We must live life forward, but we can understand it backward. And so the riskiness doesn't go away, no matter how much preparation we put in,
And I definitely over prep, so I to the test.
That's for sure. Well, it has been such a joy to reconnect and talk to you. And for all the students wondering, the Vermont reference, Judith and another former student were so good at philosophy that I had a big grant with some colleagues, different universities, and we spent 2 weeks up in the mountains of Vermont doing an intensive philosophical workshop, I guess. And all of the faculty from the 5 different institutions brought 1 or 2 students with them. And so Judith was one of the 2 I took up there to Vermont, and we had a absolute ball sitting around campfires and thinking about philosophy of religion and different ways of making sense of it in cross-cultural contexts. And that goes down for me for sure, Judith, as one of the best memories I have of what real engaged learning, or what we now talk about as the Furman advantage, like that's what I think that looks like when it is done really, really well. And it was an honor to spend time up there with you. And it's such an exciting thing to see you thrive. And I can't wait to be teaching the books that you write to the students that I have. So.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been so cool. And I'm excited to think about future students from Furman going on to grad school in philosophy. That would be awesome.
Be so cool. Well, I will make sure to put them in touch with you if they have more questions. And thanks so much for your time and being a resource to us.
Yeah, of course. I'm happy to get emails and contact from students whenever.
It's awesome.